I remember every moment of the day the war with the humans finally ended. The announcement was unexpected, and it hit us like a thunderclap. That war, so long, so brutal, had defined us for years. By its conclusion, our once proud fleets were little more than wreckage scattered across the galaxy, and countless colonies lay devastated, barely recognizable shadows of their former selves. Yet here on Thais, our beloved homeworld, the true horrors of the war always seemed distant. The battles raged far away, across the stars in systems most of us had only read about in school. We lived in a bubble of normalcy, shielded from the violence by the vastness of space and our confidence in our military superiority. There were signs, of course. Trade with the outer colonies began to falter, the once busy shipping lanes growing eerily quiet. Every few days, another solemn message of condolence arrived, bearing the names of soldiers who had fallen in distant battles. Entire families mourned their lost loved ones, their grief rippling through our communities. But for most of us, it was just the price of war. Tragic, yes, but distant enough to remain abstract. War was woven into the fabric of our identity. For generations, we had defended our empire's interests across the known galaxy, repelling threats and conquering new territories. Tyrax itself had never fallen, not even during the harshest conflicts of the past. The idea that it could ever be under threat was unthinkable. Even as the war dragged on and the casualties mounted, our confidence remained unshaken. Fewer and fewer trade ships docked in our orbital ports, until most of them sat empty, and yet we carried on with business as usual. The growing number of grieving families was a painful reminder of the conflict, but even that wasn't enough to break our belief that victory was inevitable. We were Tyrians, after all, resilient, unyielding, and determined to triumph no matter the cost. So when the government announced our surrender, the collective shock was palpable. At first, disbelief rippled through the populace. Surely this had to be some kind of mistake. Perhaps a low-level official had made a catastrophic error, or worse, the humans had managed to infiltrate and sabotage our communications. It seemed absurd to think that our leaders, those who embodied our strength and resolve, would ever bow to an enemy, especially the humans. But the confirmations kept coming. Each new announcement chipped away at our denial, until we could no longer pretend it wasn't real. Our government, the same one that had promised us victory, now admitted defeat. They insisted it was the only way to preserve what remained of our civilization. For the first time in our history, we were going to surrender. The days that followed were like a waking nightmare. Streets once bustling with activity grew eerily quiet. Shops closed their doors, schools suspended classes, and people wandered aimlessly, their faces etched with despair. Conversations were hushed, filled with questions no one could answer. How could this have happened? How could we, the mightiest force in the galaxy, have fallen to the humans? The fear was suffocating. Stories of the human occupation of our outer colonies spread like wildfire. Stories of executions, forced labor camps, and unimaginable cruelty. Whether these accounts were true or exaggerated no longer mattered. They fueled a collective terror that gripped the planet. Some couldn't bear the thought of living under human rule and chose to end their lives before the first occupiers even set foot on Thais. When the human fleet arrived, it was impossible to ignore the sheer scale of their power. Their ships, sleek and ominous, filled the skies. From my apartment, I could see their massive battleships casting shadows over our cities. The official surrender ceremony was broadcast live to every screen on Thais. We expected a spectacle of humiliation, a public shaming of our leaders, but what unfolded was strangely subdued. Our leaders were presented with a document, a simple piece of parchment, and asked to sign. No dramatic speeches, no grand displays of dominance. They signed, swore a brief oath, and the ceremony was over. The lack of theatrics left many of us more uneasy than reassured. As the occupation began, I found myself glued to my window, watching the human forces march through the streets. Their technology was astounding, tanks hovering effortlessly above the pavement, soldiers clad in powered armor that seemed impenetrable. Their discipline was unlike anything I had ever seen. Then something happened that I will never forget. A small child wandered into the street, directly into the path of the advancing soldiers. My heart stopped. I braced for the worst, expecting violence. Instead, one of the soldiers stepped forward, gently picked her up, and carried her to safety. He even gave her a small packet of food before returning to his formation. It was such a simple act, yet it challenged everything I thought I knew about our enemies. Life under occupation was not what we had feared. There were no mass executions, no sweeping purges. The humans were firm but fair, focusing on restoring order rather than inflicting punishment. I returned to work expecting to be arrested or worse, but my new supervisor, a human named Doug, treated me with more respect than my Tyrian managers ever had. Weeks turned into months, and a strange sense of normalcy began to return. The humans worked alongside us, not as conquerors, but as partners in rebuilding what had been destroyed. Over time, I began to see them not as monsters, but as people. Reflecting on the war, I couldn't ignore the arrogance that had led us here. We had underestimated our enemy, overestimated ourselves, and paid the price. But perhaps this wasn't the end. Perhaps it was a chance to build something better, to learn from our mistakes. As I watched the sun set on another day under human rule, I realized that Surrender Day wasn't the end of the world. It was the end of an era and the beginning of something new.